Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's really great to be joining you today. I want to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands that I'm coming from today. I'm in Canberra, so I'm on the lands of the Ngunnawal people. And I want to pay my respects to the elders who are looking after the lands now, those who are looking after them in the future, and those who have looked after them for many thousands of years previously. It's also been really wonderful to see the reception we had for First Nations knowledge and knowledge systems that's been picked up in the science and research priorities, and something which is for another day, but also I guess will also be something of consideration when we do look towards how we can have open access to research literature. So today, I do want to welcome you to this webinar to discuss my advice to government on open access to research literature. We have over 800 people who've registered for the event, so it's clearly of great interest, which is so good to hear. But before I start, I thought we might just have a few housekeeping matters to consider. The first is that we're recording this so we can capture the discussion, and our presenters will keep their cameras on and other external attendees and their cameras and microphones will be disabled. Any attendees from the Office of the Chief Scientist and Department of Industry staff, can I ask you to please keep your cameras off and your microphones muted because you're on a different sort of way of entering. So we have an hour and a half today, so thank you for committing that time towards this important topic. I'll start with a brief overview of my advice. Then I will introduce a panel session on the broad use cases for open access across the sectors and society. We have 4 speakers in this session, and it'll be followed by a Q&A session and then a second panel and discussion on principles and implementation approaches for open access in Australia. Just to let you know, we've disabled the chat function at this time because we're focusing on having questions for presenters. So please post your questions in the Q&A tab, and if possible, indicate who the question is for. We may not have time to respond to all the questions that are posed, so if you do see a question you like, we encourage you to use the thumbs up button, and we will try to prioritise those over prioritise the ones that have the most likes. So with that in place, I want to just give you a quick overview of the advice I gave to government. Over the last 4 years, I have met with research leaders, publishers, librarians, and many others to inform my advice to the Australian government on models for open access. This was asked to provide that information by successive governments. So 2 weeks ago, I released my advice, which considered existing models, including a funder mandate model, a repository model, and a do-nothing approach that assumed existing initiatives continued with no additional intervention from government. My advice was finalised in 2023. So I published an addendum to the advice that covers some of the developments in open access and academic publishing over the past year. Now, I'm going to assume that everyone's read these documents, but I would like to take a few moments to just summarise the main findings to kickstart what I know is going to be an excellent and informative discussion. So the first point I want to make is that access to trusted information is fundamental to social cohesion, especially in this growing time where misinformation is proliferating, and that has really accelerated in the last 12 months. Publishers, number 2, provide important services, managing peer review and editorial processes, curating back catalogues, managing copyrights, and so on. But the price users pay for these services is often considered to be too high. Existing models of open access publishing are suboptimal because they're either duplicate of the publishing model, but without the benefits, and that's something we see in repositories, or they exacerbate inequality between those who can or can't afford to pay for open access publishing, such as to obtain gold open access. Or they seek to break the publishing model, but don't address the shortfall of what would be lost without publishers, and that's in the diamond open access. Or they could do little to improve the value proposition for users beyond academia. So that's where we look at the read and publish agreements. Limited open access models that only focus on new Australian research or that are narrowly targeted towards a smaller group of stakeholders, such as improving equity across universities, will not deliver broad-based societal and productivity benefits. The public model, which I proposed, would deliver the most significant returns to society and the economy. So under this model, open access arrangements will be brokered with publishers, big or small, through a single national negotiating body, and the agreements would extend beyond the academic community to the wider Australian public. According to analysis which I commissioned from EY, opening access to all research literature could lead to an economic uplift of about $2.3 billion of GDP growth and up to 1,000 new jobs over an initial 8-year period. And it's clear that something is wrong in a system when, amidst a tsunami of available information, much of the evidence-based information is inaccessible. There's still work to do to consider these models, and I'm continuing to consult across government and the wider science and research system to build the case for open access and explore its implementation options. So that's why we're here today. We're splitting this up into 2 panel sessions, as I mentioned, and the first one is for us to consider the use cases for open access. My advice identifies a broad range of benefits for open access for enhanced productivity and an economic uplift to evidence-based policy making to improve practices across a range of professions, including healthcare and education. And of course, open access is crucial for the research community. It will provide more equitable access to research literature across all the research institutions. Surprisingly, the breadth of access varies enormously across the different parts of the research sector, from big research organisations like CSIRO and Go8 universities having extensive access to digital libraries, to smaller research institutes and universities and researchers in government departments having very limited access. But it's not only of interest to researchers. Citizens also want to access trusted information and knowledge. And I've heard this from policymakers, government, industry, professionals, teachers, school students, citizens, and citizen scientists. In advocating for a national approach to open access, we need to be clear on the benefits. This will help inform possible implementation approaches. So the speakers in this session will elaborate on the benefits of open access to academia, the non-for-profit sector, the health sector, and the tech industry. So to kick that off, you've heard enough from me now. I think it's important that we hear from potential use cases. So it's a delight to invite Professor Bronwyn Fox, Deputy Vice-Chancellor, Research of University of New South Wales, who's going to be our first speaker. So over to you, Bronwyn.
Thank you so much, Kathy, for inviting me to speak today. I just want to acknowledge that I'm joining everyone from Bedegal country here at the University of New South Wales. And it's fantastic to see the question of open access elevated to the national stage and positioned at the forefront of really important conversations in the government's current examination of the research sector. As many of you will know, open access is a crucial issue in the higher education sector. And I've been invited to provide a university perspective, but many of you will know that until recently I was also at CSIRO. So I've got a bit of a unique point of view. We all know we're currently navigating through very turbulent times marked by really rapid technological advancements, the rise of generative AI and an unprecedented spread of misinformation. Unfortunately, these developments have contributed to increasing polarisation within our societies, making it more challenging than ever to discern truth from falsehood. In this climate rife with misinformation, peer-reviewed, evidence-based, reliable research is critical to combat the effects of misinformation and to promote informed decision-making. And in turn, democratic resilience, ensuring that we are building a future where information empowers rather than divides us. However, open access is a really complex, multifaceted issue, and it would be naive to assume that the path ahead will be straightforward or without its challenges. Take, for example, the issue of price transparency. The negotiation and the stronghold that commercial publishers currently have on global research literature is enormous. Though gaps in the pricing data are available make it difficult to assess value for money, we have evidence that Australian universities are often paying relatively high fees for publishing agreements. This is where it's really helpful to consider open access on the global stage and to learn from other countries and how they're tackling this issue. For example, France has a nationwide contract with Elsevier covering 241 institutions, and that deal is worth 33 million euros annually. In contrast, Australian universities as a consortium pay a similar amount for university-employed researcher access only. And in the advice to government, it was highlighted that the Australian university sector in 2020, when Australian institutions more broadly paid more than 321 million to publishers. So moving forward, it's really essential to ensure that we are no longer left in the dark with commercial publishing deals, and it may indeed be useful to bring Deputy Vice-Chancellors and Vice-Chancellors into these negotiations, noting the recent success with this approach in Switzerland. So in Switzerland, the rectors of all of the universities collectively negotiated with publishers, including striking a deal for articles to be published open access in the Springer Nature portfolio, which is worth a considerable amount of money. It's really essential that we do find solutions, as currently a large proportion of research undertaken in Australia and around the world is locked away behind prohibitively expensive paywalls. While researchers working in academic institutions have access via institutional subscriptions, many Australians cannot access this vital, often publicly education and healthcare are among groups that do not have routine and easy access to this literature. And the thing that really stood out for me in the advice to on open access from Kathy was the lack of access for our school teachers. If anyone needs to have access to the latest public peer-reviewed science, it's our school teachers, so that they can take those students to the edge of discovery and inspire them. It's just so important. The other passion of mine is SMEs, and SMEs are estimated to spend $11.4 billion or 55% of total business expenditure on R&D in Australia, on R&D. And many of these SMEs are cut off from peer-reviewed literature. Instead, they rely on open sources of information. While many of them partner with universities and access literature through universities, it often involves a third party and asking someone for help, asking someone to conduct a literature review, whereas they really need to have this information at their fingertips, given the rapid advancement of technology that we are seeing at the moment. Australia's got some catching up to do with other OECD countries. In terms of the uptake of advanced technologies, the numbers of researchers employed by industry, overall expenditure on R&D and industry collaboration, and lack of access to evidence-based research is a barrier to innovation. The University of New South Wales is already doing work to counteract this and to bolster industry collaboration within the sector. For example, via our entrepreneurial campus program, where we host SMEs on our campus and many campuses, granting full access to our resources to accelerate the translation of research into real-world impact and foster innovation and economic growth. Like many other universities, we also host an open access repository. UNSW Works is the UNSW Open Access Institutional Repository, which enables researchers to make their research outputs freely available and accessible. It's just a start. Increasingly, we're seeing that journal publishers do actually allow this and do actually allow authors to make a version of their work open access via an institutional repository. However, it's not universal. And the University of New South Wales Open Access Policy outlines a rights retention statement as a tool for researchers and authors to use to negotiate their rights with publishers. This is such an important conversation today. Increased open access is essential for us to truly advance innovation at a national scale, which is just one of the national benefits associated with more open research. Though a complex issue, ultimately open access research is essential to ensuring that we collectively benefit from the most up-to-date, high-quality literature and continue to raise the profile of Australian research. I hope that today will mark the beginning of a series of meaningful conversations that will enable us to collectively advance open access. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks, Bronwyn. That's really kicked us off on great thoughts and really some interesting information about France and Switzerland. So thanks for that. Now we're going to turn to Dr. Sarah Oxenbridge. Sarah is a policy analyst for the Smith family, and she'll talk about the benefits of open access from the non-for-profit sector perspective. So over to you, Sarah.
Thanks so much. Thanks for the opportunity to be part of this forum today. And I'm coming to you from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. As Dr. Foley said, I'm in the policy team at the Smith family. You may have seen our ads. We're a national education charity and we work with children, young people and families experiencing disadvantage. The educational support that we provide begins before children start school and continues through primary, high school and on to tertiary education. We provide financial and personal support, educational and career learning programs and support for parents and carers. So my response today is from the perspective of the policy team here at the Smith family and the work that we do. And it's a great opportunity for me to give some context about why we care about open access and why we applaud the Chief Scientist's efforts in this area. The main reason for our interest in open access is that the financial and personal support we deliver and all of the programs we run are evidence-informed. Each element of support that we provide is underpinned by a theory of change and a logic model, and we build these from in-depth meta-reviews of research, quite extensive reviews. And this practice is part of our organisational DNA, and we do it to ensure the integrity and quality of our programs. Given that most of our sponsors are individuals, we want to be able to assure them that what we're doing is best practice and is evidence-informed. We also conduct regular evidence reviews when we're writing grant applications, and we do regular reviews just to ensure that our programs continue to map to best practice over time. And so for these reasons, we're highly reliant on academic research on a day-to-day basis. But at the moment, we only have partial access to research publications due to the journal pricing models. There are articles we need, but we can't access due to cost. And because we're a not-for-profit, we can't justify paying 130 Australian dollars for a PDF of an article that on reading might not be useful to us. So we in my team, we spend a lot of time trying to find alternative versions of the academic articles we need. Now, fortunately, some university research centres publish research outputs as free of charge grey literature reports prior to academic publication. And these, along with the conversation, are a godsend to us. Occasionally, we can find proof versions of published academic articles in the repositories that Dr. Fox talked about in universities, but there's a real risk in using these because they may not map to the eventual finished article, which may be subject to subsequent revisions. So there's a risk that we may be misquoting a version that's been superseded. Because our focus as a charity is on channeling our funding directly to families with minimal spending on overhead costs like journal articles, at the moment we just have to accept that there are journal articles we can't access. But the lack of access really does put us at a disadvantage when we're applying for grant funding. And if we had open access, we'd have access to a greater breadth of current evidence and our evidence base would be more robust. Because of these factors, we strongly support Dr. Foley's efforts to enable open access on the basis that it would be of critical value to not-for-profits like the Smith family. Thanks.
Sarah, just reminding everyone that you can place your question in the Q&A section. I'm looking forward to seeing questions and comments. So it's interesting to hear what impact open access will have and how much you rely on having evidence in order to be able to develop your programs. I must say it's really heartening to hear that our research does make a difference to the work that you do at the Smith family. So Our next speaker is Professor Meredith Makeham. Meredith is a general practitioner in Sydney. She's a fellow of the Royal Australian College of General Practitioners and the Associate Dean of Community and Primary Healthcare at the University of Sydney. So Meredith, over to you. What does it mean for professionals in the health and medical areas?
Well, thanks, Kathy. Thanks for the opportunity to join you all. And good afternoon, everyone. I'm Meredith Makeham. As mentioned, I'm a GP in the north of Sydney, and I'm also a researcher in patient safety and digital health at the University of Sydney. And today I'm joining you from Camperdown, which is on beautiful Gadigal land. And I'm going to share some thoughts on this subject as a GP, but I'm also speaking today as an academic and as an advocate of equity and transparency around the way we use data in our society. I've got a real passion for something that we do in general practice called person-centred care, which is about empowering people to be partners with their healthcare professionals and able to make well-informed decisions about their own health and well-being. And one of the key ingredients for this is access to information. And that's access to our own health information, but also to high-quality advice and guidance for people and their carers and their healthcare providers looking after them. And this guidance comes from the peer-reviewed scientific literature that we're talking about today. And like other people in the community, most of Australia's close to 40,000 GPs don't have a university affiliation, and they can't easily get immediate access to scientific literature if it's sitting behind expensive paywalls. That's the same situation for many other primary healthcare professionals and some hospital professionals too, pharmacists, physios and nurses in the community. And in the past few years following the COVID-19 pandemic, we've faced an unprecedented surge in health misinformation. As GPs, we've been part of the front line managing the pandemic, and I'll say well supported, in fact, with a rapid and well-coordinated response by our federal and state departments of health, who worked hand in glove with our colleges and leading clinicians and academic experts to translate that evidence into best practice guidelines that we all relied upon. An important part of our role as GPs is to debunk myths and offer real-time evidence-based advice. And if we face blocks, whether it's paywalls or waiting for papers to come through library access, days or even weeks after a consultation, we actually miss a crucial window to inform and support people at the time they need it most. And it disempowers health consumers and the broader community who would also benefit from access to that same evidence. So I think another critical aspect that I'd like to raise here when we consider the values of equity and transparency is the fact that the research findings published in scientific journals frequently rely upon the health information of the very people who don't have access to it. If it's your information that informs the science, you should have the right to read it, understand it, and benefit from the publications that arise from it. And at the same time, we really should acknowledge that there's a challenge of ensuring that this access is funded sustainably and that university researchers' budgets are stretched very thinly. It's a highly competitive environment, and we have facing a prospect of declining income with fewer international students coming in our larger research-intensive universities. But all of that means that it's really crucial that we explore funding models that protect people's rights to both access this information and the viability of Australia's research institutions. So I'd like to finish by saying that free access to scientific literature would be welcomed by GPs and other healthcare professionals so that they can be better equipped to deliver safe, high quality and well-informed care. And it would also empower people to take a more active and educated role in managing their own health and well-being, while it supports equity of access to information and greater transparency around the way our data is used in society. So I think Dr. Foley's proposal is one that deserves serious consideration for the future of healthcare in Australia and for the benefit of all of our citizens. Thanks.
Oh, well, thanks, Meredith. You wrote a couple of things which are really interesting. I hadn't thought about the person-centred care and the fact that people's own health data is being used by researchers and then they don't get to see the outcomes of being involved in like clinical trials and things like that. It's really an interesting point to raise, so thank you. Our final speaker in this session is Susan Travis. Susan is the Director of Research of the Tech Council of Australia, And we've already heard from Bronwyn about the fact that we've got many SMEs in Australia, and we've got a deep desire to try and lift our research translation and from the great research we do to industry, but also to develop deep tech industries in Australia. So, Susan, I'm really looking forward to hear what you've got to say. Over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you. And thank you for having us here today. It's really exciting to be talking about this initiative, and it's one we're very, very supportive of. My name's Susan Travis. I'm the Head of Research at the Tech Council. The Tech Council, for those of you who haven't met us, is the peak body for the tech sector in Australia. Now, that ranges from representing, 6-person startups working in quantum through to big companies like Atlassian and Google. That means we bring the perspective of, deep tech parts and the challenges that there may be in scaling that in Australia, all the way through to some of our most successful software companies. And it's that perspective we bring today to this really important question. Before I jump into what we think the benefits could be for the tech industry, I think it's really important for us to pause and, as just one part of Australian society, speak to how we think that there could also be benefits at the national level that many of the other speakers have touched on. We think this is really important because at its core, we often put forward, and we think that high quality evidence helps us make better decisions. And we do a lot of that work every day in terms of how we inform decisions about policy. We also see it's really important in business and in civil society. And this is something that I work on as well as the rest of the Tech Council team in actively filling these gaps in our knowledge base. We do that through producing our own research, and we do that through working with research institutions like the CSIRO to better understand the tech industry and what we can do to support the national interest. Better access to high quality existing evidence we think is in everyone's interest, and that is only further evidenced by the work that EY has done that Dr. Foley spoke about earlier. In terms of what it means for tech, there's two really obvious ways in which we see there being benefits from greater access to research for the tech industry. The first one is what it means for the deep tech part of the sector. And when I say deep tech, what I mean there is the people translating cutting edge research into commercializable products and services, thinking about the great new work that's going on with the quantum industry or some of the, very new work in biotech. A lot of firms in the deep tech part of Australia's tech industry are startups. And most people would expect that those startups are spinning out of universities, people taking their research and commercializing it. And that is a really important part of the story. But those types of startups we think are actually in the minority. Cicada Innovations, a leading deep tech incubator, put out a report last year that found that about 25% of applications for their incubator came from people spinning out of universities. Now, those people probably have great access and have sign-in to the access that many of us enjoy via universities, but it also means that a large majority, about 75% of these startups, probably don't have great access to cutting-edge research. We think better closing the gap between them and how research continues to evolve in research institutions would be a really great step in terms of moving us closer together. The second way in which we see there being really great benefits of open access research to the tech sector is thinking about the broader set of decisions that we make and how we find different sources of evidence and use that. And that may be in some of the natural or more technological leaning parts and disciplines, but it also can be really importantly in disciplines across the social sciences. So things that we learn about the tech industry in terms of the economic dynamics, as well as some of the great work that people do across anthropology and sociology to better understand how we work together, for instance. So tech companies already, I think, are pretty big fans of this. We're pretty well known through books like The Geek Way for being really, really focused on having great evidence-based decisions. In my experience working with lots of companies, the two common sources that they use is, first of all, their own data. So there's really considered reviews of what the impacts of their decisions is and measuring that to figure out whether they're going in the right direction. The second way is primarily using open access research, and we're one of the sources for many Australian companies and part of the ecosystem as well. Better understanding where there's funding gaps, for instance, can help investors raise new funds to fill those funding gaps. We think those two sources will remain and be important, but will only be much better supported by better access to the wealth of knowledge that we know exists and continues to grow through peer-reviewed research. That can help tech companies think about the context in which they operate, the technological opportunities open to them, but also how we work together, as I said before, and understand the dynamics of how the business is run and operated. So they're just sort of the couple of ways in which open access research is most obviously really incredibly quite beneficial to the tech sector. And we see this as an opportunity for us to continue to grow, solve new problems and create more great tech jobs for Australians. But really importantly, as I said at the outset, we're just one part of the broader Australian society. And, as just one part of Australian society, we think it's really important to bring this back to the national picture. And we very much support initiatives like this that can help us better connect the really great work that's being done in universities and research institutions to the decisions we make every day across policy, business, and, lots of areas of civil society. With that, I'll hand back to you, Dr. Foley. Thank you for having us here today.
That's great. Look, that was a really good introduction from everyone to give a sense of where there's quite broad interest. And we could have had a huge number of people come and talk about what that means, from school teachers, school students, even doing their final school projects in their last year of high school, through to citizen scientists and just people who really want to be able to be empowered by getting access to knowledge they can trust or information they can trust. We've got some questions here, and I'm going to start with one which is from Wayne Bradshaw, which is asking, does this proposal give Australians the right to read publications by major publishing houses, or will all publications produced by Australian researchers in these journals be published under a CC or other open access licence? That is to say, is this a genuine open access policy or just another way to funnel limited public funding directly into the coffers of publishers? So what I might do, if that's okay, is just sort of describe it, because I glossed over that because I took having read and understood the plan or the public model which I put forward. So I'll just briefly describe what it is. The idea is that instead of having multiple organisations having their relationships with publishers and then having a digital access to research literature for the people who have access to their own library, so a university or public funded agency who have those relationships are able to get the people who are in their library or are subscribed to their library be able to read research literature, so it's quite limited. This has the idea of bringing together all these different publishing relationships with the publishers together into a single entity, and that the country would have a single publishing agreement. And I had assumed it would be something like the read and publish agreements we have now, with the requirement that the same level of funding would be used, because we've been told by publishing houses that their money in the system is more than sufficient to be able to support this. So we have a single digital library, I guess, which would be having that relationship. So we would have one link into the publishers. Then for that payment, we would have a read agreement, and all Australian research will be open access to the rest of the world. But the difference is that there is an untapped audience, or untappable audience, or readers, which are the general public servants, those who aren't part of a current library, would be able to access through that national digital library the research literature. So it would be getting more value for the money we currently pay. The idea being that, so it's open access of research literature, much like we have with many of the call type and CSRO type arrangements we have with publishers. So that's all our research is open access. So yes, for Australian research, just like we have now, that the idea would be that all researchers and universities, as well as the general public, would have access to not just the open access, but back catalogue as well, because although much of the new catalogues are open access because of these new arrangements, the past and back catalogues are just as important, and many of those papers are behind paywalls because of not having been made and published at a time when it was open access. So I'll just check with my team. Did that make it clear enough? Yep. So I hope that helps. So I would say, yes, it is a open access policy. The idea is to try and make the dollars we pay already work harder for us, and that the in-kind contributions that we have with our content, our peer review, our editorial work is actually able to have some return by opening up a broader readership within Australia. So let's go to another question. This is from Danny Kingsley, who I know is very interested in this area. And she asks, can I ask for some clarity about the statement made earlier? And this might be to you, Bronwyn. She mentions a Dutch deal. I thought it was a French deal, but you might correct there, with Elsevier that provides access to subscribed material to the general public, and then they pay the same that Australia pays for only for access to academics in Australian universities. This is not what is stated on Elsevier's own website. So are you able to just give them all clarity on that?
And so what has been publicly disclosed about that deal was that in France, that was the deal with Elsevier, that it covered 241 institutions and was 33 billion euros annually. And I think, comparatively in your advice to government, Kathy, what we spend, as a nation is around 320 million. So, and that would cover, in the report too, it talks about 10% of the publishers being responsible for 90% of the publication. So that's a significant deal. And then the other one is that, of course, it was in Switzerland that the rectors got together and negotiated a range of different initiatives, in particular with the Springer Nature portfolio. But the most recent announcement was about having open access publications. So, each publication in Nature is about $15,000 if you pay for it individually, which is a significant amount out of someone's grant. So that's really important too. The message is that if we can work together and, as Kathy says, make our dollars go further, we can do more, and we can do more for the benefit of the nation rather than just for the benefit of our institutions. So I'd love to explore how we can do that.
Okay, thanks, Bronwyn. I've got another question here from Sarah Karkonen, and it's a question for the panel members. There's a lot of discussion around opening research up to Australian public, but access to something and the ability to find and understand and make it relevant to your situation are separate things. I'm interested to hear whether these plans take into account increasing the capacity of the Australian public and users within organisations to find and critically appraise the information they find, and/or would this include knowledge translation from the government into mainstream channels? So who wants to kick off answering that one? It's, maybe I might start, Meredith, with you, since this is something where you talked about empowering your patients.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, what I was reflecting on with that question was the fact that, in fact, GPs rely on a lot of evidence translation and have some very good sources of that too. So we have a journal called the Australian Journal of General Practice, which is actually open access to anyone in the world now, which is funded through our college membership of the Royal Australian College of GPs. And there's a lot of original research in that, but more so than original research, there's a lot of summaries of the evidence for GPs to understand what to do and translate that into practice guidelines. So that's a great example of the way we currently can have access to that sort of thing, but it doesn't necessarily always work because, of course, in something like a COVID pandemic, a paper might come out with some information and we haven't yet had the practice guideline update that's published somewhere we can find it, et cetera, et cetera. So you can imagine that there's been lots of occasions in recent years particularly where as GPs we've wanted to go straight to the source of the science, straight to the research itself and critically appraise that literature ourselves. Healthcare professionals and people in lots of other professions are trained in critical appraisal, and there's no reason to suggest that everyone's going to understand every single scientific paper they read. But of course, we all have some critical appraisal skills and know who to turn to ask if we don't understand something. So I think it's a very sensible approach to think about ways that this new system could support evidence translation, but the first step is to give people access to the information, and then naturally we'll be looking at ways to translate it.
Do you think AI products which might be able to say, can you turn this paper into something which has got my educational background so I can understand what the main points are that are relevant to me? Do you think that sort of thing is going to come through?
Oh, look, no doubt, no doubt. I think the whole question of the way AI is impacting healthcare, we could probably spend another 3 hours, 3 days on that one as a webinar. But we just have to be mindful of the risks associated with AI in healthcare, and we're cautiously thinking about ways that we're protecting people's privacy and doing things safely. But there's definitely the academic landscape has changed significantly, even in the last 2 or 3 years, with the impact of AI, and I'm sure that it's going to be looking very different in healthcare as well.
Thanks for that. Now, Fiona Bradley's asked the question, how do we develop a holistic approach that incentivises researchers to engage with NGOs, end users, industry and policymakers in creating and disseminating research findings? Engagement is necessary to synthesise access to information as well as access itself. So maybe I'll go, Sarah, to you. Do you want to, from an NGO perspective?
Just briefly, there are certain research centres that are really fantastic at translating everything into research reports, applied research reports that are absolutely fantastic for end users like us. And the benefit of these grey literature reports is that they come out well in advance of academic articles. So in some cases you strike gold, but in other cases you're left waiting quite a while for an academic article to come out. So where there are these research reports that we can access, that's fantastic. Otherwise, we've got gaps.
Okay, no, that's good to know. I might move on because we've got quite a few questions. Michelle Debrow has asked, recently we've seen a lot of last-minute decision-making from the government regarding international student caps. I'm concerned the Chief Scientist Public Access model could similarly be a subject to sudden policy changes by government. How can funding uncertainty for the public access model be managed? Will institutions need to wait each year to see the resources, see which resources will be included in the national subscription? So I might park that question, actually, Michelle, just because that's probably more an implementation one, and we'll come back to that. So the reason I read it out was it did have a large number of thumbs up. So let's maybe go to another question, if that's all right. Looking at, this is from Jessica Fakes. This is saying, this is a question for everyone on the panel. In the general discussion about open access, I miss the engagement with sustainable and equitable model for books. Book publishing is still very relevant for researchers in the social sciences and humanities who pursue a career in academia. While they would prefer to publish their books in open access, especially if it contains policy recommendations and research relevant for NGOs, etc., there is a lack of funding in Australia and other countries. I would like to hear your thoughts and ideas on this. So I might first of all go to Susan from the perspective of startups and Tech Council. Does this have any impact for you, or do you want to comment on that?
Look, I think it's a really interesting question and an interesting next avenue to look at. What would the benefit be? What are the rationales for it? I think it's a slightly different question, importantly, when we think about, who informs and funds a lot of the research that ultimately ends up in journals. There's a very clear, I think, rationale for ensuring that taxpayers and people who support that work have access to the end product. Books is perhaps a little bit different in the sense that it's, in my understanding, primarily a private sector activity. Now, that's not to say it's a bad idea by any means, but perhaps a slightly different one. One thing that I'll note is that, books in their form are one important source, but what we also do see is that many authors and people obviously who read the books and reference them are able to effectively disseminate some of the key parts of that as well, and supporting free and open discussion in, venues like this, or in the media, or in some of the work that we may do in terms of some of the people may currently think of as open access research. I think will continue to be an important avenue of that. But certainly once something like this could get up for peer-reviewed and existing academic research, maybe that's something that could be looked at in the future.
Okay, and I just saw one of the Marks put their hand up. Do you want to just jump on? You might have had something to say there. You're on mute still, Mark.
There we go. Better.
Yep.
I was just going to say that more and more of the academic books that are published are becoming open access, and I think that when we're talking about pieces of work, we're talking about articles, book chapters, conference proceedings. I think we need to broaden the scope beyond just journal articles when we're talking about research outputs. Thank you.
Okay. So maybe we can hold that over to the next panel, but thanks for jumping in there. Well, this will be the last question. Even though there's a few more, we'll take them on board, because part of this is consulting to just hear what the views are and ideas that are coming through, which are fantastic. So Cheryl Hamilds asked, this is for you, Bronwyn, how do we draw the non-university library sector that lack a national coordinating body like CALL into national agreements, for example, the clinical hospital-based libraries? Is there an expectation that the expenditure that happens outside the university sector will be brought into a national pool? That's probably more for me.
I think it is actually for you.
Yeah,
I think that's a great principle, isn't it?
Yeah, so what we did was go through and this isn't just leaning on the universities. This is actually when you add up all the money that is spent with publishers around Australia, it's of the order of $500 million, because the universities are only part of the sector. They're a big part, but public funded agencies, government, state and federal government departments, they're all got subscriptions. So part of the complexity will be working out how best to approach the funding of this. Do you claw it back and bring it into a central pool? Do you have fresh money? Do you approach it in a different way? But this would be, in order to make this happen, this isn't passing the hat around. This would actually be quite significant structural change in the way we operate and think about our relationships with publishers, and be setting up a different mechanism, which would be based on, sort of whether it's an act of parliament or something like that. So it isn't something where you think, are we going to get funding this year? And then you'd probably have to have some sort of organisation that would go through and using experts such as those who are in CALL and other places to be able to go through and identify what those publishing arrangements are like. But this is at the moment the early stages where we're getting the ideas out there. And the next stage is actually getting into the detail of how do you implement something with the eye on what you're trying to achieve. So I hope that answered that question. But before we just close off, I'll just quickly go around and hear if there's any final words. Meredith, did you want to just have any final words before I wrap up?
Oh, look, thanks, Kathy. I think just to reiterate something we haven't spoken that much about, it are the rights of people to access their own information, and really thinking carefully about the principles of equity of access to this as well, because it's obviously just simply unaffordable to a lot of Australians to be able to contemplate buying a scientific paper, and that immediately puts an unfair barrier in society that shouldn't be there.
Can I add something which is really interesting? Some work that was done by Home Affairs found that, and it's been reproduced by others, both on either a ad hoc basis or a personal experience, or I think Nature also did some work on this. And they said that when the general public come against a paywall, they distrust what's behind the paywall. And it's counterintuitive, but it's sort of very interesting that it also creates an interesting mindset. Susan, do you want to have any final words?
No, nothing to add at this time. Just a big thank you. It's an amazing panel and it's great to hear so much support for this initiative.
Oh, thank you. Sarah.
Oh, just one point. As someone who spent many years reviewing academic articles for journals, I did that free of charge, and I would be very happy as someone who has reviewed for the research to go public and to be translated for public use.
Okay. That's that in-kind opportunity, seeing your personal contributions actually getting some return in a broader sense. Rowan, last word from you before we move on to the next panel.
Just two really quick things. One thing to amplify what Susan's already said. We have a vibrant, thriving SME community in Australia. They're going to be the next big industry. How do we support them to get to where they need to go? Through access to the best peer-reviewed literature. And then we have an incredible collective bargaining power across the country. And it's wonderful to be here talking about how we can harness that and use it for the benefit of the nation. Thanks, Kathy.
Oh, thanks, Rowan. And thanks, panel. And just stay there because I'm sure there might be times like we had with Mark just jumping in if there's something in the next panel. So thank you for that. We're going to move on now to the panel session on principles and implementation approaches. And the consultation I've undertaken has confirmed there is a broad support for open access to research literature, and you just heard some of it with our previous panel. However, there are a range of views on the approach needed to get there. And I think it is important to start with principles. And if we reach agreement on these, the implementation approaches become clearer. These are the principles that I developed through consulting with a wide range of stakeholders. And I'll just quickly go through them. The first one, if you want to just quickly click them through. Is to maximise the benefits from Australia's existing expenditure on academic subscriptions and publishing. We've already said it's of the order of $500 million a year. If you go to the next one, allow people residing in Australia to freely access all peer-reviewed journal articles across all disciplines, including all new journal articles from the date of publication and all previously published journal articles. And the next one is ensure Australian-led peer-reviewed journal articles are in all discipline areas are openly accessible internationally from the date of publication. Support research integrity by facilitating the provision of quality metadata, keeping versions of record and assisting in discoverability. The next one is preserving bibliodiversity and the author autonomy regarding where to publish. That was both those last two are very strongly upheld principles. Recognising the role of publishers and ensure their sustainability of their businesses. One of the things we've seen since the translation of the days of libraries holding the books and the physical copies to where publishers now hold the digital copies has been a real shift in how we actually preserve our knowledge and knowledge base. So in some ways, you could say that publishers are the custodians of humanities research literature these days. And so thinking about what that means with future models is something that is important. Then the other one is the use of infrastructure that is user-friendly, internationally interoperable and designed for future developments in publishing and open access. And I think that's all of them. Is that right? Oh, no, and that's right. We want it to be equitable for all stakeholders. So I think that's all of them. And as noted in my advice, the focus on most open access approaches has been on increasing the proportion of new Australian-led journal articles that are published open access. However, journal articles authored by Australian researchers comprise less than 4% of the global research output. That's why I've put forward the public access model, which would provide all Australians with access to all paywall content, past and present, in academic journals, as well as ensuring all Australian authored journal articles are freely available to the world. The panellists in this session all have a wealth of experience in advocating for and developing and implementing open access initiatives. So they're top of their field, and they are well versed in current issues within the academic publishing sector. They will address some of the implementation issues arising from the principles and different approaches to open access. So to kick things off, I'd like to introduce our first speaker for this session. This is Mark Sullivan. He's the Director of Open Access Australia, and we'll be calling him Mark S because we have a Mark R later on. So over to you, Mark S.
Thanks very much.
Yep, good.
Thanks
All
very
good.
much, Kathy. So in response to Dr. Foley's article earlier this year in The Guardian, Open Access Australasia issued a statement urging the release of this advice to government so that it could be discussed in the context of other approaches as well. So we therefore welcome the recent release of the advice and the opportunity to respond today. We reiterate overall our position that it is very important that any national approach in Australia supports three things. Firstly, a diversity of approaches to open access in scholarly communication. Secondly, equity for both readers to access and authors to publish open access. And thirdly, the diversity of scholarly research outputs, which some of the other speakers have already alluded to today. Regarding the diversity of pathways to open access, we recognise that there are diverse pathways to open access currently being practiced, which are essential to ensure that diverse communities of publishing can thrive, including academic-led approaches and those that serve underrepresented communities, such as Indigenous research. We support using the most effective ways to sustainably make research open, using the most effective infrastructure possible to deliver this, including and beyond costly commercial publishers. We would like to see more innovative ways of making research available, including investment in national repository infrastructure, local journals, and in Australia's knowledge capacity, thus making a positive investment for the Australian taxpayer and the research community more generally. We would also like to see investment in an enhanced discovery layer to Australian research that supports interoperability between repositories, complementing existing services such as Trove and adding additional new functionality to showcase the diversity of Australia's broader research output. We would like to see Australian research funding agencies adopting consistent open access policies and mechanisms to monitor compliance, and we acknowledge their ongoing consultation with the community, with ourselves and with other stakeholders on policy direction. We are concerned that recent trends show the overall amount of research being made open access is levelling off, but this is at extra expense as green transitions to gold via read and publish agreements. And we are concerned that this trend could be accelerated by the public access model as described in the advice, particularly if provision is not made for these other avenues via a step change through bibliodiversity. Regarding equity for authors and readers, overall we strongly support equity in scholarly communications to both access and publish research, and I think the other speakers have also already supported that. We believe that in considering a national approach to open access, Australia has a unique opportunity to initiate reform concerning the endemic inequities that are present in the current scholarly publishing system. And these manifest in geographical and linguistic biases, including the marginalisation of Indigenous knowledges. We assert the importance of equity and the role that bibliodiversity plays in providing equity by allowing alternative pathways to open research dissemination that enables underrepresented or excluded voices to be heard, including via local infrastructure and publishers. We are concerned that the suitability of the MyGov portal for access and the tension between open access and an authentication gateway, noting that international models require national library involvement. Regarding diversity of scholarly research outputs, overall, we support the development of an affordable, diverse and equitable publishing ecosystem. We are concerned that the advice focuses only on peer-reviewed journal articles, and we are still unclear how the model would scale in terms of accommodating thousands of academic publishers. We recognise that Australia's libraries currently provide access to and preserve the entire breadth of research produced in Australia via repositories and subscriptions, including journal articles, books, theses, data, software, creative media, and much of the unique content in repositories is not available elsewhere. We also support a broader commitment to open science in line with the UNESCO recommendations, where research output in all of these formats, not just journal articles, will be made available to the public wherever possible. In this context, we are concerned that scaling back investment in repositories, rather than supporting them, mitigates our ability to support the dissemination of these other forms of research. We therefore support investment in Australia's capabilities and open infrastructure, including repositories and existing local journal publishing infrastructure, providing quality, robust outlets for Australian disciplines and expertise. Finally, we strongly support a cross-sector joined-up approach to enabling copyright in research to be retained by researchers and their institutions, either through coordinated policy or copyright reform, so that the research can be shared more easily. And we thank Dr. Foley once again for consulting Open Access Australasia throughout this process and for the opportunity to respond today.
Thanks, Mark. Some good thoughts there. I should just add that since we've talked about the MyGov approach, we've actually been advised that Egypt has a sort of a public model there, and they apparently the local IP address has proven to be sufficient so that you don't need to go for an extra authentication portal. So that's just an interesting new data point. Anyway, let's keep going. I wanted to ask Jane Angel. Jane is the Executive Director of the Council of Australian University Librarians. They're responsible for many of the read and publish agreements that are in existence with many of the publishers so far, which was referred to in the addendum because a lot of that work's been done in recent times. So over to you, Jane.
Thank you very much, Kathy, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm joining from Ghana country here in South Australia. CORE welcomes Dr. Foley's focus on open access, and we certainly support the overarching aim to unlock knowledge for the national benefit and to put publicly funded research into the hands of all Australians. We welcome the opportunity to respond to the considerable work in Dr. Foley's advice on open access models. But CORE does not support the public access model outlined in the Chief Scientist's proposal, because it is not a strategy that will drive the transformation of academic publishing towards an open future. The model would build upon CORE's work negotiating read and publish agreements to extend read access and publishing rights to all Australians. However, it will facilitate increased open access publishing only up to the limit of caps imposed by publishers. This will not constitute open access to all of Australia's research. It will allow Australians to read paywalled research published in journals at no direct cost to the reader, but it will not allow these to be shared or reused, activities that are core to the definition of open access. While Australians would have access through the national subscription, the rest of the world would not, and this is at odds with the principles of open access. A national public access subscription model is not an open access model. For all the reasons noted in Dr. Foley's proposal, the global scholarly publishing industry requires urgent reform. CORE has a deeper understanding of the nuances associated with negotiating and managing read and publish agreements, more so than any other stakeholder in Australia. And we contend that the public access model will entrench the existing issues, which sees enormous profit margins derived from free academic labour. CORE negotiated read and publish agreements have significantly increased open access publishing in Australia and Aotearoa, with more than 45,000 open access articles published since 2020. But read and publish agreements are not the end goal. They were always intended to be an interim measure to drive the transformation of publishing models. Internationally, there is recognition that read and publish agreements are not accelerating the transformational change needed and that a broader strategy is required. The open access models articulated in the advice are presented as mutually exclusive, yet national strategies elsewhere typically employ multiple pathways to open access, facilitated by various mechanisms, including repositories and community-led journals, and incentivised through mandates and transformed reward and recognition frameworks, as noted in the addendum to the advice. It is not only possible to apply multiple approaches in a coordinated way, it is essential. The additional costs associated with the public access model cannot be offset by reduced expenditure on repositories, as they are essential infrastructure for making non-traditional research outputs, including creative works and software, open access, for maintaining complete records of institutions' research outputs, and for bridging the gaps in universal open access to Australian research. Repository infrastructure must be maintained, and indeed it needs renewed investment. CORE cannot support the recommendations as they have been articulated. We do not support further investment to develop the public access national subscription model at this moment because it is not open access and it does not address the well-documented issues associated with the current for-profit scholarly publishing industry. A national strategy must aim higher, adopting multiple approaches to truly advance open access. It must not be based on the principle of ensuring the sustainability of publisher business practices that are designed to advance commercial rather than community interests. CORE advocates for and is ready to engage with the development of a progressive open access strategy that supports a diverse publishing ecosystem and multiple pathways to open access. One that prioritises equity and will facilitate the quality, usability and sustainability of Australia's research, putting Australian research outputs into the hands of global citizens. Thank you very much for the opportunity to respond and be part of this very important conversation.
Well, thanks, Jane. I did ask you to be robust and you certainly were, so I appreciate that very much. It looks like there's a lot of common thinking in that from the reactions that came up. So I appreciate you doing that. So look, finally, we have Mark Robertson, who's a consultant for the Asia Pacific International Association of STM Publishers. So Mark, you, I guess, get the chance from a publisher's perspective to talk about how you see open access and ways forward.
Right. Thank you very much, Kathy. And it's great to be part of this event. I actually just lost my internet connection. So if you end up, you can't hear me, somehow maybe get in touch with me on the WhatsApp app.
Yeah, we can hear you now, though. That's good.
Okay, good. All right. I'm on the land of the Wurundjeri people in Melbourne and speaking to you from here. I'm a publishing consultant, of which I will do quite a bit of consulting work for two not-for-profit organisations. One's Chorus and one is STM, and that is why I'm here today. And I just would like to say that I was previously the publishing director for Wiley in the region, so I've have experience of publishing many journals on behalf of Australian learned societies. STM is the International Association of Scholarly Publishers, and we foster collaboration and innovation across the wider scholarly community. Whilst we speak for our publisher members of all types and sizes, we also advocate globally for the whole publishing sector, including the long tail, which has been mentioned in the work of the chief scientist. STM members have been responsible for innovation and investment into systems and technology to enable access to research and to reduce the burden on researchers. This is referred to in the advice with the comment that these important features all have associated costs. The advice refers to the evolution in publishing of research outputs over time across the whole of our ecosystem, and it is to be welcomed that it recommends building on what is already in place, so continuing the evolution rather than starting again. Despite the comments from Jane of CALL, the publishers have been working with CALL for very many years, and we have usually found common ground going forward. So we would hope that part of the ongoing process is not only include all the publishers, but include CORE and the universities as part of this central negotiation. The advice talks about open access and public access. An open access article, as many will know, is available for anyone, anywhere, anytime to read and is published under a CC license. As is stated in the advice, 56% of Australian articles were published open access in 2023. So it's really a question of how the proposals of the advice can accelerate the trend rather than setting up anything new. Defining Australian-led, which is also mentioned in the advice, will be important. Are we talking Australian-funded, work done in Australian institutions? And what about international collaborations on multi-agency funded work? The fourth model in the advice is for public access, which I think is different to open access, to all globally published output in the participating publishers' journals for all Australians. I think the two resolutions need to separate these routes, although they could be negotiated together. Open access of Australian-funded research and public access for Australians to all research purchased by the country. A public access model that works in Australia right now is the Cochrane Library of Systematic Reviews for the healthcare sector, which is publicly available to all Australians through IP authentication as administered by the publisher Wiley and in conjunction with NH and MRC. And the other group that some of the publisher members of STM have thought about is the public libraries. Can we use the public libraries to also add some curation in terms of providing all of this material at public access? One challenge for the centralised funding is that a single nationally held one-line item could easily be cut by government in a budget cycle or eroded over time. And I think it was on one of the questions in the previous session, this was raised. And what happens if public opinion begins to doubt the value of peer-reviewed evidence-based research output and calls on government to cut the funding for the acquisition of research outputs? So whilst generally agreeing with the proposed principles, I will close with 4 points from the joint STM and Australian Publishers Association submission to the Chief Scientist in 2021, which we feel are very important. First, solutions be built on evidence, not opinion. Second, ensure funding in the publication system is adequate to protect quality, sustainability, diversity, and integrity. Third, not to compromise the ability of the publishers to invest in adding value. And fourth, and probably the most important, above all, the focus must be on the researcher and user as the most important members of the ecosystem. So thanks very much, Kathy.
Okay, look, thank you very much. There have been some really interesting feedback and we've got some interesting questions here. So I'll start at the top here. Chris Hatherley has asked, could you expand on the author rights retention strategies? This is to Mark S. And how these would help support more open access. Mark, over to you.
Thanks. I think the main purpose of author rights retention strategies is to ensure that authors retain the rights to publish their research output other than through a commercial publisher. So that could be via an open access publishing platform or through a repository. So
can I just jump in there? So an open access, so who actually pays for, because the thing with digital is it's a digital platform. If anyone who runs any non-for-profit or anything are really expensive to run. So I'm just curious to know how you go about that and who would pay for maintaining that what you described as another way of publishing. Just how do you pay for that?
Well, they're usually paid by the institution that hosts them. So it's the same type of cost structure around repositories.
Oh, okay, right. Okay, sorry I interrupted. I've always wondered. So yes, so it's adding cost to the organisation that's running, that would maintain it, and that you'd have some sort of interoperability linking up.
That's right, but I think the going back to the question, the need for the rights retention is so that there is that ability to do that.
Right, and so that then you would see. So at the moment, our metrics are designed for publishing in regular journals and things like that, and looking at citations and the metadata and things like that. Do you see for that sort of approach to have a different metrics way, or how do you actually get to the point where things are able to be collected for that important aspect of being able to assess research in terms of competitive? Research is competitive, the grant scheming is competitive, and do you see that also goes hand in hand with actually revolutionising the way we assess our researchers and identify who we're going to give money to and who aren't we going to give money to in competitive granting rounds?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's all related to research assessment and the encouragement of research in high impact journals, etc. And it's something that just needs to be reassessed. And I think that's what the aim to do in Australia is to reassess the way research is assessed itself.
Okay.
And
No, that's okay. We don't need to go down there.
Comments on that.
Yeah, so that's fine. Look, here at McDonald's asked a question, which is advice clearly articulates very problematic nature of the current for-profit commercial scholarly publishing industry, including high profits, etc. I'll just jump through to make it simpler and faster to read out. However, your principles include ensuring sustainability of these same business models. Can you please explain this paradox and how the public access model will ensure value for money for Australian taxpayer? So I've come from a premise that publishers do provide an important service. One of the things which I guess in my role as Australia's chief scientist has been the importance of the peer review process and being able to assess research as being the best possible and one which can be trusted. So managing the whole post-publishing process, and having been an editor-in-chief of a journal for a long time, I fully understand the complexities of doing that and managing that. So my feeling, my approach has been to recognise that the role publishers play is one which would be very costly to reproduce. And then the second thing is that the back catalogue is humanities knowledge. So if we were to turn off all the current publishers, what happens to the back catalogue? Who owns it? How do you access it? Who will maintain it? How will we actually, as digital platforms change over the time, and we all know that when you actually upgrade a digital system, it's actually very complex and expensive to be able to turn what was in the past, maybe our floppy disks or even a tapes in years gone by, and turn it into the new technologies as things go on. So that was where I was coming from, is that paradox is saying that I can see we have a system which actually understands and has been able to develop a process that allows publication to happen, to manage that peer review process, to maintain trust in the research, but also then manage the lifetime of that information for forever, I guess. So that's where I was coming from, and that's why I've been approaching this, where I've had that level of respect for the role that publishers play. I do agree that they've been very good at monetising that, and this is where we're trying to get that discussion to say, how can we actually get better value for money so that we are actually opening up things to be broader. I think at the moment some of the discussion has said that we're best using a current design. I had this idea that this would be actually having quite different arrangements with the current agreements so that they would be much broader. But that's clear that we need to discuss that more. So let's move on to another question. People don't want to hear from me. This is from I'm just. Oh, right. Oh, sorry, some hands up. Sorry, yes, Mark R., over to you.
Thanks, Kathy. At the moment, if I'm a researcher and I'm in a university that has access to journals, I can connect to a journal, and then through the references in an article I might read, I can connect to other articles. I can just connect all over the world to all of the research that I want to see, if my university has bought that research, of course. If the article is in a repository or in other places, it is not as easy to find for the whole world. So although new systems might develop over time, which do connect to the research literature, I really value your support of the fact that right now, the journals all connect, the book chapters, they all connect. And by making that part of this future policy, it's going to be a better way forward than trying to reinvent the wheel at this stage and get all of that connectivity.
Okay, thanks, Mark. And Jane's got her hand up, so over to you, Jane.
Thank you, Kathy. I was just going to make a point about the role of the publishers in terms of there being a central component in this ecosystem. But I guess we'd like to see some more transparency about the cost of publishing. And in reference to Mark's point earlier about innovation in publishing, we see those really as add-ons. Like, we'd like to know about the cost of publishing in regard to the content, irrespective of any other tools or instruments or add-ons that might be applied alongside the content. So I think we're really talking about open access content here. And I guess what I'd also say is if we did have a multi-pronged approach to open access, that would mean that the publishers weren't simply the main game, and that might actually disrupt a little bit about the funds travelling in that one direction.
Okay. Yeah, that's a very good point to make. Thank you. This is from Judy Redding, and she says, publishers have a monopoly currently on specific intellectual content items. How and what strategies would the government use to defend against exorbitant inflation costs imposed by publishers when universities have struggled with this, being unable to cancel key titles despite the cost increases? So I'm just wondering, Mark R., if you want to jump in on that. I'm not sure if you're still there because you've disappeared.
Yeah,
but are you still there? I guess
Yeah.
one of the things I'm interested in with this is in Australia, we clubbed together for creating the way of having a single relationship with each of our pharmaceutical companies. And that's been very successful because we have a big country negotiating with a big business, as opposed to us, sort of smaller universities or groups, because it said here universities have struggled with this. Do you think this rebalancing of negotiation between publishers and, say, a government rather than publishers and smaller subsections of the sector would actually have any impact? And I'll go to the others as well on this question, because I think it's an important one, especially since other organisations do those negotiations. So from a publishing perspective, how would this rebalance the negotiations so that you might be able to end up with the fact that costs have been going up and are getting to a point where they're prohibitive for many universities to continue to have the same access to the broad catalogue?
I can't express the view of any single publisher.
Sure, no.
Generally, because a different publisher will have different opinions. But I would have thought that the negotiation at the moment between the publishers call and then all the individual universities is relatively complex. Involve many steps. Whereas if there was a central negotiating team talking with the individual publishers, I think that's going to save cost and time for everybody concerned, it still has to be managed, of course, but personally, and this is not a view of the members, I think making it simpler in this way is going to be a good thing.
Okay, I'm just wondering if anyone else on the panel wanted to respond to that. There's quite a lot of other questions, and I can see it's rapidly running out of time. So, look, there's. I'm just trying to work out which, with all these great questions to ask next. I guess there's a question here from M. Johnson that's got a lot of thumbs up, which is the fundamental problem of how for-profit publishing has warped and broken research publishing strategy, resources allocation, reward and recognition is not addressed by this policy. I'm just wanting to, I might actually go to Bronwyn, because you're in the research sector in the university in a senior role there. You've heard quite a different view from from CALL and from other open access interests. If you're able to just comment on, where you've seen the publishing process warping the whole system, I guess, and if you've got any views on that.
What I've seen, I guess, and heard of is that bigger organisations have more bargaining power than small ones. And so the pricing transparency that Jane referred to is really, really important. So that we have a more transparent, even equitable system that we can all access. I think, there's some high-level principles, and it's really great to have this discussion and to have a diversity of views. It's so important, and it's really important to hear from CALL because you have such depth of expertise in this domain in particular. And I think there's some points there about repositories and open access, use of repositories, as well as rights retention that require some further discussion. We started this by saying this is not an easy problem to solve, and it is complex. There are multiple stakeholders. We're in a global system. We're very appreciative of the work that the publishing and the big publishers, commercial publishers, do, but we just we acknowledge that there's a point in time where things have changed, and we need to reflect that change and make sure that we're responding to the global environment where there's a lot of misinformation, and making sure that we can provide greater access to evidence-based information for the general public's welfare.
Thank you. And I think Mark R has got his hand up. Thanks, Bronwyn. And then we'll hear a wrap up, because we've got some great comments and questions. We're not going to get through them all, but the whole idea of this was to get things out and hear what the broader community had to say. And so this is just the beginning of a conversation. But Mark, over to you.
Just in response to the last point made, that it's not just the big publishers who publish stuff. There are the smaller publishers, as in IOPP, which Kathy knows as well. There's the university presses. There are very small publishing organisations across the world and in Australia. So we need a solution which meets the needs of everybody, and just bearing in mind some of those smaller or medium-sized publishers are putting quite a lot of money back into their particular communities. So Institute of Physics, that money goes back in Institute and the members.
Yeah, so look, thanks for that. And Jane, and actually what I might do is go around and we'll just hear a last word from everyone. So Jane, last word from you, and if you want to respond to that last question, please do.
Thanks, Kathy. I was just going to say that all of the recent comments really put in mind that we need this sort of broader discussion about an open science policy, a national conversation, bringing in all of the different stakeholders and a set of principles and practices to really guide how open science can be accessible to all and benefit broader society.
Thanks. And Mark S., do we want to hear final words from you?
Thanks, Kathy. And I might just say something here that I won't be speaking on behalf of Open Access Australasia when I say this, but when I was involved in your process earlier on, I actually personally felt there was significant merit in it and in the public access model. And I was just struck today by the contrast between the earlier speakers who spoke about the use cases and about how this public access model would be fantastic for them, contrasted with the rest of today's discussion where we've sort of delved into some of the issues and perhaps positions that are opposite to that. So, and I just wanted to say that I personally believe that there's still merit in the public access model, and I'm saying that as my personal opinion, not on behalf of Open Access Australasia. I just, I wanted to recognise the other speakers and the way that they passionately put their cases today as well. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Mark. And I guess we'll hear from Mark Robertson as our final words from you.
I think it's all been said, but I think a public access of the research literature for Australians is a really good idea, and we're moving towards open access as a community anyway. So I think go for it, Kathy, please.
All right. Look, what a great discussion. I really like hearing the contest of ideas. I really like the idea that people felt that they could bring very different views to the table. So thank you very much, both to Jane and Mark, who I think it's important to make sure that we do acknowledge that. I want to thank, there's a lot here, and I had this great idea that I would summarise, but it's I think what the summary is that there's a huge use case there to broaden access to research literature. And this is something where the evidence is there, and I do work on evidence-based information, that there's a value there. There's clearly, from looking across the research community, a level of unhappiness with the current arrangement, with the way we actually undertake publishing. What I did hear, and I'll be honest in saying that some of the different models that were discussed today beyond the public one also add a lot of cost to the system as well. So it's not as though this is going to be something which leads to free. When we talk about free, it's actually someone has to pay. And I think this is something where we need to design a model which is sustainable, that maybe we haven't got those principles right and we need more work on that. But it's one where I will need to disrupt the system, because the evidence I'm seeing is that people are coming from this from different perspectives, and we haven't nailed all those different perspectives yet to get to a point where, first of all, there's a common understanding of what we're trying to achieve. And I thought it was interesting to hear splitting it up into two, same approach, but two different, thinking about it in two different ways. The other is this is an area which clearly is hugely important and worth pursuing. And it's one where we've really got things out on the table. So look, thank you, everyone, and thank you to the audience. Apologies that we had so many questions. There's no way we could have answered them all, but they have provided us some initiative to know where the thoughts are with the audience. I'm not sure how many people have actually called in today, but we know that 800 people have shown interest, and there's been a lot of articles in the newspapers and on LinkedIn, which says that this is clearly important to Australia. So let's take it from here. And I want to say thank you to our panellists. Thank you all for joining in today and giving me so much time. Sorry we've run over a little bit, but I think this is something which is the start of an important progress in open access. And I look forward to engaging with you all again sometime in the future. So let's call it quits now and say thank you very much. And also thanks to my team behind the scenes who've managed to keep everything going. And I'll look forward to our next conversation. Bye now.